So, what I'm going to talk about today or this evening, is what I've been working on for last year as a consultant in Southeast Asia. I classify plants and I explore unknown communities in Asia, tropical Asia, and the Americas. I have for a number of years. And I'm interested in the issue of biodiversity, I'm interested in the fabric of life. I'm interested in living creation that is 3.8 billion years old. And I see this living creation is, as y'all are aware, we're right now bearing witness to one of the world's great extinctions. They call it the sixth extinction, because human populations are expanding into, everyone knows, into natural areas to accommodate people and their insatiable desire for material belongings. And in that activity, we're actually now fouling the nest, the Earth, planet Earth. Now, it sounds like a cliche in a way because you've heard it so many times. I love you can mean nothing, and it can mean everything. And what I'm talking about means everything. And it gets less attention than anything. Everyone, if you turn on the television, every day you'll hear about global warming. And we're sinking hundreds of millions, if not billions, into questions, getting one UN meeting. You know, it's not about the future of the Earth, it's about global warming. Now, not to underestimate the threat of global warming, but we're talking about 50 to 100 year time spans and how we will have to deal with hurricanes, rising tides, flooding, droughts for 50 or 100 years. What I'm talking about is the end of living creation within 50 years. This is what's happening to the Earth, and it gets very little play on TV or in scientific circles. I started out as a biologist, as an explorer, and a person who studied nature, and I classify plants and I characterize plant communities that have not been studied before. And most of my work these days is in the subcontinent of Indochina, which basically embodies 5 countries, which would be, let's see here. Can you see this little? You can't. So there's down here, the tip of Indochina is the Vietnam Delta. Above the delta is, of course, the long and narrow country of Vietnam, Cambodia. Above Cambodia is Laos, and to the west of Laos is Thailand. This more or less comprises the subcontinent of Indochina, an ancient subcontinent on this earth, a subcontinent that always persisted. It didn't go underwater like Texas did. The hill country used to be a coral reef. Well, Indochina is an ancient landmass, as old as terrestrial habitats, which is about 480 million years old. So a very interesting area of the world, and it's an area of the world that is, they call it Indochina because it's sandwiched between India and China, 2 of the world's great civilizations with a long history. The civilization of India is about 4,000 years old. Civilization of China, in terms of big nation states, about 5,000 years old. Now, today when you talk about Indochina, usually we're referring to the colonies of the French, which excludes Thailand. So there's a modern historical context of what is Indochina. It has to do with French colonialism because they colonized Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia up until about 60 years ago. And then, of course, these countries gained their independence, which led to, of course, insurrection, the Cold War, U.S. interventions in Vietnam, and so on. And that included, of course, involved as well carpet bombing of not only Vietnam but Cambodia and Laos, a part of our modern history that very people have heard very much about. We dumped more bombs on Cambodia and Laos secretly during the Vietnam War than we dropped on Europe during World War II. And it was secretly unknown to, or at least unacknowledged by our Congress. So this area of the world kind of does involve U.S. history, but very quickly we forget everything. Now, why I went there is because this is a very unexplored area. The most conserved and unexplored areas of the world are not democracies, and they're not on the economic train or bandwagon. Really, communist nations were the last to be destroyed because they didn't develop themselves economically. World Bank didn't give them bridges, World Bank didn't give them roads, and so their trees have been left intact. But now, in the 21st century, everybody's having a free-for-all. Why? Because China has 5% of its forests and they're damaged. Thailand has 10% of its forests and they're damaged. Maybe 1% of Thailand is pristine. These are countries that were 100% tropical rainforests in the past. The Philippines, 10%. Vietnam, 10%. This has all happened in one human generation. 10%. That would be like America cut down all its trees except for those in Colorado, Florida, and Georgia. I mean, can you imagine? Or our grasslands have about 2% conservation. So really, what we've done to the Great Plains is what these countries have done to their tropical character and the fabric of life there. So what's happening is these other big countries, that China and India, and of course all the countries of the world, are going to these small, formerly communistic countries to get their wood and to get their resources, to develop them so that they can prosper. And in so doing, we prosper, obviously, monetarily. But the cost is the unraveling of the fabric of life in the source of really some of the oldest really civilizations of the world. So it's an interesting topic. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is just one aspect of it. I'm interested in exploring, and I work a lot with mountain and tropical rainforest florists. But I'm going to talk about the Mekong River because I've been engaged with the Mekong River Commission, a consortium of 4 ministries from the 4 countries that I've mentioned: Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They have established 20 years ago an agreement to come together and take care of the Mekong River, one of the 4 last healthy rivers of the world. The Rio Grande is not a healthy river. It's turned into, at this point, what was once the Grande River, what we call it, or what they call the Raging River, Rio Bravo in Mexico, is now basically a sewage relief for Matamoros and Reynosa now. And sometimes it doesn't reach the Gulf. This is the fate of the Mekong in very short order in all likelihood. So this is, and what's important is that sometimes you can look at one facet of the world and extrapolate for the Earth itself, and that's what I'm going to basically going to be my message today. Show you what the Mekong has been, the Mekong River, which is twice the size of Rio Grande. It begins in the Himalayas and comes down to the tip of Indochina. So it bisects that subcontinent of tropical Asia. And so this is the way it looks schematically. It begins in the Himalayas, and the Mekong is a very narrow channel, just like all big rivers. They usually start in a very distant mountain, and then they pick up a lot of water in a landmass that will be, represent many hundreds of miles or kilometers. It comes down from China very quickly, steeply, from the mountains, and then it winds its way. It is in many cases, it's the borderline between Laos and Burma, Laos and Thailand, and of course down here, just the delta makes it to Vietnam. A lot of people have very important vested interest in it because it's the food security of this subcontinent of the Earth. Where there's water, sun, and earth, you have high productivity. And you don't have that much productivity in the Himalayas because the water is mostly in a deep channel and removed from the sun. But as it moves down to the flatlands of China and Laos and Thailand and finally to Vietnam, as the water hits the flatlands, it spreads out and brings together that convergence of the minerals of the earth, the sun, and perpetual water. And from this is photosynthesis comes, and one of the world's, if not the world's, most productive fishery found in a very large lake down here called Tonle Sap. So, and that's how I got involved with Indochina. Can you see this here? Can you see the blue, very interesting formation, unlike anything else in the world. The Mekong rises 7 or 8 meters a year, every year during the monsoon season, and then goes down 7 or 8 meters. Now, when it does, it floods the land, and when it floods the land, this is just what rice growers need. It creates swamps for miles and miles from the shoreline, and the people have historically taken advantage of that. But the river is a commons. The river is essentially shared by everybody. Not only is it productive, you don't get steaks in Indochina, you get fish. Because it's so productive in fish, and the fish migrate up and down. So the fish distribute themselves throughout the river, but they grow primarily in this lake and historically in the delta, but no longer. So this has been basically cultures and festivals. Everything basically follows the rhythm of the monsoons and the reaction of the Mekong River. So the Mekong River, it defines the culture, defines the economy, defines in certain parts the moral fabric of these areas of the world, because this is what provides the sustenance for civilizations of all varieties that have come and gone. It sustains a lot of people because it produces a lot of rice, and that is the staple. With fish, the largest freshwater fish in the world comes from the Mekong River. The largest freshwater skate comes from the river. There are many interesting. This is a catfish that migrates out to sea to feed and then goes back upriver like a salmon to breed. It has one of the highest diversity, second only to the Amazon, for reasons that are not completely known. Probably the hypothesis is there's 2 rivers that had evolved fish fauna, ichthyofaunas, came together, and basically you had the evolution of entire fish biota, and then they came together into one river, because it has about 900 species of fish in this river alone, which is much more than North America has in its one river system. There are more fish in the Amazon basin than there are in the Atlantic Ocean, for reasons that are not understood by scientists. That's part of the great mystery. Scientists study what they can be sure about. They are more and more these days hypothesis testers. To test a hypothesis, you have to take the world, break it down, simplify it, take 1 or 2 factors and say, I'm studying these factors, I'm sure of this. But we reduce the world to such a point where we are studying trivia constantly. The bigger the subject gets, biodiversity is the new name for nature or living creation. The diversity of life forms and the way what holds them together is such a massive topic that people don't really study it. If they do study it, they study it with computer models, not by going out. And what I study is the distribution patterns of areas of diversity and areas of endemicity, that is where you have very rare restricted organisms, which is very high in Indochina. So the subject of biodiversity, very few people go into it because you can't be certain. If you can't be certain, you can't publish. If you can't publish, you won't be hired. If you're not hired, or even if you are hired, in my case, there is no money for this. Everybody's studying right now global warming, the exploration of the world. These Laos, those don't show the cities, but anyway, this country right here and this country right here do not have a PhD botanist. They don't really have a plant collection in their country. Or what collections they do, they represent maybe 1/10 of the floristic diversity. And they're making decisions what to do with their, and it's been like that with their forest wealth. There are vast landscapes unknown to science, not new species, entirely unique plant communities unknown to science, unlooked at. The French were not big in exploration. They were very lazy colonial powers, and they liked white-skinned Vietnamese girls and cognac in Vietnam. They didn't like to go into the mountains. The English in Thailand, they go straight for the mountain. The French are not like this. So we don't know about anything about these areas of the world. And they're disappearing because Vietnam, Thailand, China, and other countries are going to these countries and basically illegally buying tropical hard timbers and developing the land. So what we are really looking at, within the last 20 years when I started, Cambodia opened up, when it opened up to the outside world. It's a very complicated history. It traces from this closure to the Vietnam War. They opened up 20 years ago. In 20 years, they've gone from 70% forest cover to 30% forest cover. So in 20 years, this is enough time for a child to go to college. We have removed half of the natural fabric of life and damaged the other half, at least half of that, in 20 years. And it's moving at a faster pace. Now, the fate of the river is going to be much the same, only it's going to happen faster, it would seem, for reasons I'll explain shortly. So the reason I'm working with the Mekong River Commission is because they want us to, I work with a group of modelers, including sociologists, hydrologists, zoologists, economists, to try to predict what putting in dams on the river. The river has massive volumes of water because there is the Annamite Mountains that come and separate. Let's see, the Annamite Mountains are up here, separating Cambodia from Vietnam, 5 meters of rain a year, and it all washes into the Mekong. This is why it raises 8 meters. 8 meters, of course, is 4 feet every year. So flooding is a way of life there, and everybody, it's tropical, so you just basically take off your pants and walk around in your underwears and chanclas and just deal with the mud. Because of all that water, you have lots of rice. Because of all that rice, you have prosperity and not very much problems with food security, but that may well come to an end soon. So what I'm going to do is take you down, look at it historically. Historically, we have a natural river that begins rushing in the high, deep channels with rocky bedrocks of mountains. It comes down to a floodplain in the middle reaches, the middle Mekong. So if you look at the structure of the riverbed, in the upper reaches, the water is deep and swift flowing because it's flowing in very steep canyons of rocky mountains. Once it gets down to flatter land and the water starts moving slowly, it naturally builds levees or dikes. And those contain the river during the dry season. But during the wet season, it overflows, it creates more of a dike, and this is what the people use to where they grow their rice. And then in the lower reaches, it's so flat that the water extends out for 50 to 100 miles from the bank during the wet season. So it's really more like like the edge of the ocean, the way a tide will come up and just spread itself out. So there's different faces of the river. This is what it looks like in China. Now China is not part of the Mekong River Commission because they're upstream. They have nothing to gain by being part of a consortium of people who want to share the river because it's their river. So they're putting in dams one after another. There's 8 big dams on this river already. And they have plans for about 15 more on the main stream. But you can see, if you look at the river on the side, the vegetation is only goes up 10 to 15 feet on the bank. And that's as high as it goes during the flood season. So you have these shrubby, woody shrubs and not very high diversity. And that's the nature of the river vegetation in the upper reaches. As you go down to the middle area, it takes on a different face. As you can see here, there's very big levees. It looks a lot like what we have here around Roma. You have levees that contain the water, but on an annual basis, the water goes over and moves up about 20 miles from the river bank. And the rhythm of life follows that. And the people are exploiting the river for fish during the dry season and growing rice during the wet season. This has been going on since about people have been adapting themselves to this rhythm for many centuries, if not millennia. And so the floodplains begin at the capital city of Laos and can be found throughout the river going down, with one exception. So these areas, these parts of the river are not so interesting in vegetation because it's just like here on our Rio Grande River, the banks erode, they're disturbed, and weeds come and go. But there's one stretch in the river that has a very unique vegetation, unlike anything in the world. We call it an endemic species and endemic plant communities because this is the only place in the world where you'll find it. And it's in a stretch of the river where the bedrock in the flat area comes across. It's not a mountain, but the substrate underneath the river is rock, and so it doesn't erode. And as you can see, forests and shrublands grow within the water. They are aquatic plants. They can grow tall. If you live on a sandy bank, only little plants that live for a year or two can survive it because when the floods come, it washes everything away. However, if plants can, in this bedrock channel from southern Laos to parts of northern Cambodia, you can end up having something with a totally different character. Cone Falls has as much water going through it as Niagara Falls. And along that rocky substrate, you have vegetation that goes into the river and stays there. And all the life forms that have evolved on this river depend on that. They have evolved, to find their role and their niches within this vegetation. And it's very sensitive because the vegetation will not go up above the bank more than 2 meters because it can only photosynthesize during the low period. When the monsoon comes for half the year, all these plants are underwater and they drop their leaves and they go into a dormant period like our winter plants do because they're underwater. So we have this shrublands such as this plant, which is widespread, or we have these bizarre trees. Look how they grow in the Mekong River. This is their growth habit. You can tell which way the current's coming. Their trunks guard their roots. And it's like a Dr. Seuss land or something. It's crazy. Now there are 6 trees that grow like this from different families. And these different species of trees will grow in different areas for reasons unknown to us. Why? Because in the last century, I've done the literature review on what we've studied the vegetation of the Mekong River and find that in total, there's been the scientific surveys that total 3 months historically on the Mekong River. We know nothing, and we care nothing about it. When you don't even go for it, that's because you don't care. Now, we bombed these people. We destroyed them. And we offered no assistance to do this. The National Science Foundation has not explored unique and unknown communities of plants for half a century. There is no money for the exploration of the diversity of life forms. There is just scientific studies trying to say why are certain areas more diverse than others, and there's modelers and experimenters. But these areas of the world are now threatened, and we don't even know what could be lost. If you are ignorant of a certain richness, you will ignore it. That's where that word ignorant comes from. So we ignore these things at our own peril. This is one river. The whole earth is going down. This is a fact of life right now. And all of our attentions are on things that we're listening to on TV. And for some reason, we had a vice president who wrote Earth in the Balance, and he highlighted the issue of global warming. This is going to, in 50 years, at these rates of deforestation, the world will be 10% forested in 40 or 50 years. That's your lifetime. And no one's studying or trying, really assisting in any real way, the understanding and the conservation. There's money that the World Bank puts forward, but it determines who gets the money, and they don't really fund people who will get in the way of them and their dams, or them and their irrigation schemes, and so on. The World Bank and science is behind this destruction. Why do I say science? Because technology is what makes possible the exploitation of one of the world's largest, 11th largest river. That takes a lot of know-how to build dams on that kind of. Well, that we can do, but we can't send people out to study and understand the fabric of life, which is very unique. With those trees, of course, are associated smaller plants, some living under the water, some living on the banks, some living on the rocks. Like I said, this endemic flora has been looked at for about 4 weeks by one person in the history of the world. It has apart from unique plants, unique animals. 8 of the more charismatic turtles are all endangered now because people ate them all. It has one of the world's few freshwater dolphins. Now this has become a source of money for Cambodians because people go. There's about 75 of them left in the river. They were never too prevalent, but 75, they're on the verge of extinction. Now the most important part of the Mekong is the lowermost reach, because this is where the water stretches out, as you can see, and it's very shallow and it's very broad, the river itself. Now, this shows the extension of forest. There's much less forest now. This is a very dated map. But notice that there's a forest around the lake here. But otherwise, this whole area is agricultural land. And why? Because this is the floodplain of the lower reach of the Mekong. Now, that floodplain then goes from the delta all the way up to the north of Cambodia. Because when the river gets down to this area, it splits off. One half goes to the ocean. The other half goes to a lake. So it has a divergent current during the monsoon season. One goes out to sea with very high waters. The other one washes into this backwash. This is like a big aqualung. And in this country, every year for 6 months, as the monsoons come, it expands 3 times its low water size, and it floods that forest. And then the water slowly recedes, and so the Mekong River has a current that goes into the lake, and then it reverses current and goes out to sea during the dry season. So this river right here goes one direction half the year, the other direction the other half a year. Nothing on it like this on Earth. And because it floods this forest, fish come into the forest, and this is where they lay eggs and they grow and they get fat, and then they go back into the main currents and distribute all the nutrition from this big flooded forest into the whole system. And people are able to exploit the fish that much. So this is the historical and the present day floodplain of a river. I don't think you can see. Well, suffice to say that this is maybe 600 miles of a floodplain. So I'm guessing, I'm not sure exactly what it would be. So there's 2 of these really shallow floodplains. One is the Vietnam Delta, which is this way it looks like in the early morning. If you look across that delta, there's lots of rice. The French are responsible for expanding, basically taking over the entire delta 100 years ago. They exported the rice to Singapore. This is a map of the agricultural lands in the delta. 1926, you can see it's already been decimated. So in historical terms, the most productive area of the lake, of the river, is now 100% grassland, 1% protected. So the delta is now has no a natural. It has one or two small, maybe 1% is protected. But this right here is an area that I call the Tonle Sap Lake, is the linchpin to the productivity of food in the Indochina subcontinent. And as you can see, it's surrounded by a forest. And that is all. You cannot see the forest in September. All you can see is seagulls, waves. It looks like the ocean. And there are pufferfish, there are flounder, there are freshwater dolphin. This is such a big river that many elements from the ocean decided to make their home in freshwater ocean called the Mekong River. And this is what it looks like from an airplane. And there's different types of vegetation on it. And I studied this I was asked many years ago to do the conservation plan. I was given 3 months. No one had ever studied this lake before in terms of vegetation. And so I was given basically 2 weeks to prepare for a trip, 30 days and nights being on the lake, and then a month to come up with a conservation plan that had 3 months and $1 million to take place. 2 months before the deadline, no one had been on the lake yet. This was done by UNESCO. So the UN had 3 years, $1 million, and they never got on the lake before the deadline. This is just one little vignette. This is the way the world works, and people really are not that aware of it. The only way you could be aware is to get your feet on the ground, and there's just no invitation to do that because there's no money. The reason they have a flooded forest on that lake is because the French, as a colony, they made, instead of having wood concessions, they divided the lake up into fishing concessions, and they leased it out to warlords. And this has been perpetuated up until about 5 years ago. The people who got the concessions would shoot anybody who comes onto their fishing hole. And it was very effective. But for various reasons, mostly from overfishing, the yields are coming down. Life on the lake is ancient, and as you can see here, people live on houseboats. Went to many floating villages where they said they'd never seen a European before, and they thought my looks were very funny. But everything you can see, they're firewood. They float gardens. They're born on the lake. They die on the lake. They've never been on dry land before. Groups of Vietnamese, itinerant Vietnamese who've invaded it, and the Cambodians, the Khmer culture. You can see the history of fishing there. You have people who hang out. That's not an igloo right there. That's a little hut with where they put chum pots and they spear fish. This is a butterfly net from a boat. This is a massive pulley that has a butterfly net that this is about maybe 30 feet in diameter. This is about 130 feet in diameter. It's like a big oil rig. You just kind of... and then these are the nylon nets now that pervade it. Nylon gill nets. Now there's hundreds of thousands of miles of these weaving through the lake. Not sustainable because it kills everything. The most intriguing way, really, the commercial way they fish this to export the fish from the Tonle Sap is during the dry season. They cut a channel through the vegetation. They put a bamboo fence so that when it floods, it's a corral. All the fish that have gone into the floodplain breed, and then they go back up to the mainstream. Well, they go back through the corral, and at the end of the corral, there's in the middle of the lake, there are these traps. So all the fish just go, just herd them into these fish traps, pull them out, send them to market. Tons and tons and tons. not only do we not know that much about the fabric of life in this area of the world, we still don't know exactly how many fish, how productive the lake is, because no one can get to the true numbers because everybody cheats on their numbers. They're going to be taxed. So, very interesting. Well, I came up with a conservation plan that, to make a long story short, 3 different areas of the lake that are somewhat different from each other. So we have 3 months of work on the Mekong River to make a decision and to make predictions. What will happen if this comes to pass? What this is, as you can see, here's the Mekong going from Vietnam all the way up to China. These red bars and these yellow-black bars are dams in progress right now. Excuse me, working dams. These red bars are proposed dams for the mainstream of the Mekong. Laos, the country, wants to make itself what they call the battery of Southeast Asia. This is a map. All these little triangles, red, blue, and green, are dams for the tributaries. There are 100 dams that are now slated to go into the Mekong River in the next decade. The Rio Grande has 3 dams. The Mekong is going to have 100 to its tributaries, and maybe something on the order of 30 on the mainstream. Now, what happens when you dam a river? Several things are going to affect the rhythm of life. For one, during the wet season, the flood line is going to go down because all these dams are going to be collecting the monsoon waters as they pour into these empty reservoirs. So during the flood season, there won't be a very high water line because all the reservoirs are going to be charging up with water so that they can release it during the dry season and make some money when it's hot and everybody's going to be using air conditioners. Okay, so the high water line that goes up 8 meters may go up maybe 3 meters in the future. The low water line, which goes down 8 meters, is going to go up because everybody's releasing monsoon waters in the middle of the dry season from 100 dams. So the flood regime, which was massive and maybe 60, 70 million years old as a natural process, is finished. There will be no flooding. That's what dams are put in for. Now, not only will they make money with the hydroelectric power, but they will sell the water as for irrigation because there will be no more flooding. So they're commodifying the commons, an entire river, historically, that defined the way of life in Indochina. And we've done that in America. The Colorado River, which goes out to the Sea of Cortez, Gulf of Cortez, in Sonora, just south of Arizona, used to be the largest wetlands of North America. But we put the Grand Coulee Dam, several dams near Las Vegas, and this is North America's largest wetland today. The Delta has no water because it all goes to irrigation in North America, southwest U.S. This is the plan on steroids for the Mekong River. Are you aware of that? National Geographic has done an article on it. But the potential loss for us is the whole fabric of life, the whole cultural fabric of life of human societies there. And what happens when that takes place? Well, one, there will be less food security. How will the fish migrate if there's 100 dams? How will the fish be able to feed if their forest is not flooded? They have no access to the plants. So there will be less food, there will be no rhythm. And when you take a people and totally, a people, it's not a people, when you take 100 cultures and change their environment, their culture has developed on account of their unique environment. You take out the environment, they have no more reason for that culture. When they don't have reason for culture, the moral fabric, and we're also looking at the food security, unravels. And you know what happens when that happens? War, destitution, lack of security. Now, Vietnam is at the Delta. It's the most powerful nation in this area of the world. And Vietnam is now what I'm doing is coming up with a model so Vietnam will be able to say, okay, if we put 5 mainstream dams here, that's going to reduce our water flow in the delta. Vietnam has 110 million people. Cambodia has 11 million people. Vietnam has 110 million people. Their main breadbasket is the delta. How are they going to feed the masses? Well, what we're doing, not by my decision. Instead, 9 years ago, I did this earlier. They took our results because of the vegetation report, and they shelved it. They put it back and they said, do not cite this. It's not approved. Never refer to this. This is, because they hire us to do these studies. And then they say, if they don't like the outcome, they say, we never did the study, don't cite it. And so that happened 9 years ago. Now we're the same company, the same funders, we're doing it again because we're not saying, should you do it or not? What we're saying is, this will be the cost of Vietnam, and they're going to recompensate Vietnam for its losses by allowing them to have investment in the dams. So they're going to pay, basically, recompensate them for the loss of agriculture, and everything else, fish culture, and so on. So really, it's just cutting up. It's just cutting up the resource. But in so doing, they're going to destroy its productivity. And so there's consequences. Now, we always look at this. The reason that we have a Mekong River Commission is because there are social and economic repercussions. It's not because we're going to destroy the fabric of life. If we have, there are about 8 dams slated to be around those unique forests that are in the rocks in the mid-reach, those are going to disappear immediately because they're going to be flooded during the wet season and they'll drown in the first or couple of years. So these unique types of vegetations will be unknown to us. We don't even know. And I'm trying to get money to say, hey, somebody fund me so we can characterize it and maybe recreate it in the future. So far, no interest in anybody. That's where we stay on biodiversity. That's where we now position ourselves in the issue of biodiversity. It gets no attention, and yet it really is gonna hit us 50 years before global warming will. This should be our number one. This is living creation. These associations, this biota is 100 million years old, and in 1 or 2 generations we will finish it. And this is not a country. This is a subcontinent. After we've already taken out the subcontinent of India, 10% forested. That started in the 19th century. So civilization began here. The Indians went up the Mekong 2,000 years ago and established an outpost about 1,400 years ago in southern Cambodia, which moved to about 1,000 years ago, a little bit more, up to the shores of the Tonle Sap. So here's the lake, and Angkor Wat, or the Angkor complex, arose a civilization, the most spectacular ruins I've seen in the world. And I've been to Egypt, and I've been to Israel, and I've been throughout India. I study iconography. And I have to say that this is the most spectacular contrivance humankind has built that I've ever seen. And I've traveled the world for 30, 40 years. And it's incredible. And it's based on Hindu and Buddhist culture. This dwarfs the size of them, but the temples are big lotus flowers. And they're 3-dimensional mandalas. And they are built in the image of a cosmogram of Hindu and Buddhist worldviews. This was built 1,000 years ago. It's one of the main sources of income for the country. Their people are arriving. It's industrial scale. It reached a pinnacle of artistic expression in the Angkor area about 800 years ago. This is just one lintel. And there are something on the order of 200 ruins in this area of the world, of the Khmer culture. Now, I've reached the conclusion that science kills us. science is no good. Not inherently it's not that it's no good. It's that science and technologies are tools. They provide us with the capacity to do things right or to do things wrong, to do things selfishly, and unsustainably, or otherwise. Science and technology has hastened our suicide. It's never solved the problem without creating a more intense problem. Every single advance we have, one way or another, the net, in terms of the environment and the earth, the fabric of life, the net result is a loss. Whatever it is, making roads, making bridges, well, it can go on and on. The cultures that established Angkor Wat were Hindu and Buddhist both. These are the first countries in the world that developed, or that history allows us to understand, they developed an environmental ethic. They environed a conservation policy. The first person to do that estate was Ashoka in India. The first edicts of India that were recorded are saying no more hunting, no more drinking, no more women, and what was the third? The fourth. They had Ashoka gave up killing animals because the high caste, the Buddhist monks and the Brahmins, reached a theological doctrine, reached the point where they said, in fact, all creation is my equal. In fact, I am creation because the soul of God, I have the soul of God, as does the fish, as does the pauper, as does the king. Don't really have time to go into Brahmanic theology right now, but the idea is, the notion is that every living creature has the same universal soul, which is the soul of living creation. Brahman is what they refer to it. Now, in Buddhism, they don't say everything shares the same soul. They say that everything shares the same inexplicable void, but all creatures are equal. So if you read the text on which the architecture and the iconography of Angkor Wat reflects, from the Mahabharata for the Indians, or a number of ancient texts, the most ancient of the Pali Canon of the Buddhism, this shows the way people were thinking 2,300 years ago. In the Anugita, the Mahabharata is a religious text that is 7 times the combined size of the Iliad and Odyssey put together. When the Indians did a religious text, they did it over the course of 200 years with about 20 cities doing a portion of it. You know how some people, that Notre Dame took many generations of masons to create the temple. Well, the Indians did that, and they also, their texts were monumental efforts as well, 200 years with everybody going into it. So the Bhagavad Gita is one song of this 18-book epic myth. And within it, they say this. This was their perspective on living creation. Non-destruction of all creatures, that is deemed to be the greatest duty. This is early Brahmanic thought. This is the highest seat, free from vexation and holy in character. Every living creature and its salvation, what we can do to conserve it is holy. And of course, to not embrace that attitude is sin. From another area of that classic text, those born with godlike endowments are self-restrained, tranquil, free from avarice, with compassion for all beings and freedom from a desire to injure them. So the idea that basically the religion of the Hindus was one that recognized the equalness of creatures, including plants and animals. Now, Buddhism is a sect of Hinduism, and this was their earliest text. Therigatha says this: when seated on the bank of a river covered with flowers, with garlands of variegated woodland plants, happy indeed, a sage will meditate. He does not find greater contentment than this. So the great sages and wise men would isolate themselves in a forest. And their greatest contentment was to reach their states in meditation, surrounded alone by living creation, by the forest. He who's seeking his own happiness does not punish or kill beings who also long for happiness. You will find happiness after death if you don't harm any creatures. That's the Dhammapada. I could go on forever, but here's my point, is we are turning to the wrong people for the solutions for our suicide. We turn to the politicians. We turn to the bankers. We're not turning to them. They just stepped in between us and the environment. And we put our trust in science. Science doesn't do this. Science won't support me. I'm a scientist. I'm from the old school. That's how fast we've changed. I got a PhD from UT Austin. My field died upon getting my degree, in the terms that I'm interested in exploring unknown areas of the world. There's a mountain in Mexico that has 12 plants that bear my name because I explore. In one weekend, I found 12 new species of science in many times over in Mexico. And I'm doing the same here. There is no scientific support for this. This is true science. What we're interested in now is genetic engineering. That's what biology is. Science is not going to cure it. There is no economic basis for this. The economy has never saved a forest. The rarer a rhino horn gets, the more desirable, the more profitable it becomes. Economics cannot solve these problems. The only thing to solve this challenge is human values. And if we begin with the Eastern religions, this is where we'll find them in full maturity, identifying the fate of human beings is tied to the fate of the living realm. And in the case of the Mekong River and the rest of the landscapes, I'm giving this area of the world 30 years. In 30 years, Laos will be down to 10% of its forest. The Mekong will cease to flow to the ocean, and Cambodia will be the same to match up with Vietnam and Cambodia. When you lose all the possibilities of nature, when you lose nature, you lose mystery. I live for this. Money doesn't satisfy me. Only discovery does. Why? Because the mystery means you don't know. And what's unknown gives you reason to hope. When this goes, there will be no hope. There is no hope in Haiti. There is no environment left there. That's the end point. From mystery and creation and religion, this is where people find the mystery and find the human values. If you commodify everything and put a physical price on it, then you run into this Oscar Wilde's definition of cynicism. A person who knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And that's what we've done to nature. And so I'm at the point where science is not. I understand as a scientist. We know enough to do the right things, but we won't do it. It gets down to human values. So, be able to address these questions at this point, I'm going to be trying to set up my own NGO that works with Buddhist communities in Indochina, because nothing else will work. I've tried it all. And it's no different here than it is in Cambodia. 2% of the valley is intact. When I talk to Fish and Wildlife, they're interested in just a few animals. They don't get the idea that the Rio Grande is a tropical river. So this reflects what's going on in the valley. It reflects what goes on in Africa, in South America, Central America. And it's interesting to consider what the consequences are. And I think I've just reached the conclusion that we have exhausted all the possibilities of money and science. We need to go back to the roots of human values at a time when India and the rest of South America is totally seduced by computers, by service industries. India is not seen anymore as being a source of spiritual revelation. It's seen as a source of innovation in computer technology. That's the end, my friends. That's not going to save us. So that's my story on the Mekong, and we can leave it open for discussion.
Thank you so much.
Has anyone been to Asia here?
Now's the time.
It's, now is the time.
No, really.
Now's the time. Gas is down to $1.60. You can get a round trip. I haven't actually looked, but you can get a round trip ticket probably for around $1,200. Get a cheap Chinese round trip ticket, and see it while you can, because it's not going to last. And the people who go with those landscapes, it's very easy to work with Buddhist societies to travel there. Any woman can land in the capital of Laos or Phnom Penh or Cambodia at 3 a.m. at airport and walk to a hotel, no problem.
That's good to know.
Yeah. No, this is a big deal. You go to Indonesia, and no woman better be out on the sidewalk alone, because they'll grab her.
Traveling as a woman.
That's right.
That's really important to know.
Buddhist societies, not Hindu, Buddhist societies, Indochina.
I have a question if no one else does, but I don't want to eat up questions if anyone else does. Awesome. So I've seen you speak before on touching on similar topics. How do you, as a person, maintain your presence to continue to look at such challenging realities?
Well, I just bear my sorrow. I lose myself in these areas. I go to the edge and I go into the forest. And so, the paradise is right there. I'm interested in limestone mountains. All you have to do is walk into one canyon. No one ever goes into them. There's nothing you can do with them. To those people, they grow rice. And they know there's spirits up in those mountains. Leave them alone. And it's perfect because you can walk 100 meters into a pristine forest, and you just walk back 10,000 years. Well, of course, it keeps me alive. Coming out of it and looking over my shoulder and hearing that they're taking the chainsaws are at work. This is nothing. Like everybody, it's between depression and elation. And I do study also Eastern religious thought quite a bit. And that's also been an asset in understanding. Because those texts, the reason they're talking like this, the reason they have these scriptures, because this dynamic is ancient. They wouldn't talk like that unless they were having troubles with the decimation of India. And so, in Brahmanic and Buddhist thought, you're taught not to care. That's true. Although it's a paradox. You must have compassion, which means sharing the suffering of all creatures, but you're to be indifferent to victory and failure, because that's just part of the impermanence of material creation. So I'm kind of stuck between the Western scientific and the Eastern, what's the term? Scientific versus metaphysical world. So it's difficult, actually. But what's the alternative?
I have a more narrow question. So you show the tree with the roots hanging to the side, and you say you know which way the stream is going. Then you said the stream was going both ways.
Yeah, but it goes hard during the monsoon in one direction, and then it slowly subsides in the other way. So it doesn't rush out; it rushes in. It rushes down actually, but then when it starts subsiding, it's a slow. It starts slowing down.
It's interesting that the river flows north.
Well, you know.
Or that it flows north and south.
Yeah. Well, it goes north and south. It flows, but then it goes kind of. Of course, north is not up.
Yeah.
You know, it's all elevation.
Yeah.
But no, there's nothing. There's really nothing like this in the world. And the nature of the forest, it's really an arid land. When I first started studying it, the UNESCO people were saying it's all short forest. It's been damaged by everybody for so long. And so the idea was on the inner banks of this big lake. On the inner banks is really big. Oh, actually, I think I have a slide. Has really big trees. On the inner banks, as you can see here, the trees are real big. And then on the most of the floodplain, you have a shrubland. And everyone thought the shrubs were a regrowth forest, but they're not. The plants are underwater for 4 months out of the year. And then the plants that are in the upper floodplain get dry after 2 months. So they have to deal with the dry season for about 4 months without any water because the lake leaves them behind. So they have a thorny deciduous vegetation. The deciduous that the leaves fall during the flood season when they're underwater. But they have a thorny thicket. Does that sound familiar around here in South Texas? That's because these plants are living like they do in South Texas. Because they're underwater, they can't do anything underwater, so they go to sleep. So when they're living, they have about 6 months out of the year where it's hot as hell and dry, like here. So these are actually, the shrub is actually the native vegetation. It's a flooded forest, and then it's an arid land vegetation simultaneously. You know, no one knew this. No one figured it out because no one had looked at it before. And those kind of strange curveballs that nature presents, you know, these are marvels, and they're also very instructive to teach us, you know, about the way the landscape operates and behaves. And well, if we understand it, you can manage it. The UNESCO people only wanted to save these forests. The inner forest, though, only has about 5 species of tree. The upper forest, which is thorny, has something on the order, on average, 50 species of trees. So the diversity is in the shrubs, not in this. UNESCO was getting ready to just take the inner rung of the lake and say this and say the rest of it's disturbed. Pure ignorance for having never seen it, and they were getting ready to declare a conservation plan like that. This is the best we seem to be able to do. This is really disturbing. But I can't say it's any different in the U.S. because there is no money or interest in the U.S. to explore creation. What's the difference then?
You talked about how they're going to supposedly compensate somebody.
They negotiate.
Somebody's going to get compensated for the loss of all this productivity from the flood-based.
Right. The compensation
long-standing-
is hydroelectric dollars,
And I'm wondering,
but it's money, of course, for a
wondering
few
if
people.
that will get concentrated into an elite.
Of course, no. There will be 50 people in each country that own the river and its resources, as opposed to 60 million who share it at present. That's exactly what's happening with our banking system. That's exactly what's happening with our tax revenues. You know, they go to 800 bases around the world. We serve the interests of, of people who control, the markets and the money. And we're just basically what we're doing to these areas of the world is what we did to the Western U.S. 150 years ago. And we do it with blinders, just as we did in the West 150 years ago. The Christian marched to the West, right? As we committed continental genocide. We're committing global genocide right now, because these people, once they don't have food, they're going to have to go work for a factory, and the factory will be getting hydroelectric power in Da Nang, in Hue, in Saigon, in Phnom Penh, in Bangkok. That's what it's all about. And so you go from a life on the river to basically the redundant life of, sewing tongues into Nike shoes for year after year after year. This is development, supposedly development. Forecast calls for pain here. It's only a lasso long. And you know what I do is I just keep going to the next horizon. Burma is my last chapter, because everything else is Laos and Burma is all that's left now of Asia. 2 countries out of this massive continent.
Why did you start studying Indochina instead of Central or South America?
Well, I started out in Mexico. Most of my work was in Mexico for the first third of my profession.
Sorry, let's repeat the question so everyone can hear. What was your question?
I said, why did you go to Indochina instead of South or Central America?
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you, sir.
I was working on a treatment of morning glories. I classify morning glories. That's one of my specializations. So I was in Paris, looking at the original species where the name is attached to the specimen. So I had to go to Paris to see the original collections to which the name was published, to make sure I know what I'm looking at. And I was taking a break, and I went to the Museum of Man in Paris was having a tanka display. A tanka is a Tibetan picture, mandala picture, of, it's Buddhist cosmograms, and they have all these very, spiritual fires, and they have pig faces, and they're crazy. And I noticed that there was a common theme in every one of them, and it was a big lotus flower in the center of the mandala, because that's what the mandala means. It means wheel, and the wheel is the flower. And a symbol of the wheel is a chariot wheel, which is used by the sun gods and by the thunder gods. So the flower is the lotus flower is all of those images you saw of the architecture and the art. It's pure lotus. Everything, every temple from Persia, from Iran to Japan, is built in the image of either a lotus flower or a lotus grove. And within that lotus, I noticed that the Buddha is always sitting there in his meditative lotus position, different mudras, but his eyes were downcast and he was looking off into the distance, and he was emancipated. He had transcended suffering and desire from the world, always inside the lotus. And I looked at his face and I said to myself, he looks like he's high. And he is, of course. He's beyond. And he's in the middle of the lotus. And he is every single doggone time. Every god stands on the lotus or sits in the lotus. And I thought to myself, I've had downcast eyes like that before. And I was under the influence of powerful compounds. And I said, I think that lotus might have some kind of role as a narcotic. And I said to myself, I was working in Jalapa, Mexico, living in Jalapa, Mexico at the time. I said, you know what, if I'm given half the chance, I'm going to study that, because I'm an ethnobotanist. Another thing I do is study the history of human beings and plants. And so I told myself, if I have half the chance, I'm going to go and study that. So I had half the chance, Harvard University had a plant collecting, a botanist position to collect plants for cancer and AIDS research. And they needed a person to be the collector in Indonesia for 4 years. So I got there, and I spent the rest of my life. I have a 2-volume text that will be published one down the history of the lotus, and it's 4,000-year history because it is the symbol of the Taoists, of the Jains, of the Hindus, of the Buddhists, and the Zoroastrians. It's the plant of the gods, and I'm pretty sure, and this is hypothetical, that it's the most influential narcotic plant of the world. And it had a name, the narcotic did, called soma. And I've been nurturing this, coddling this project for 20 years, and it won't leave my possession until it's up. I've taken 4,000 shots of temples around the Far East, and that's one reason I'm going back to the pagodas, because of that lotus flower and my interest in it. That's what took me to Asia. And once I got there and I saw, oh, this is fun, and since I can't go to Mexico anymore without fear of being kidnapped or get in trouble, I'll just go to Laos.
So a random stop in a museum in Paris.
A random stop, that's right, a lunch break in Paris, and my ambitions were defined.
That's pretty cool.
And that ambition and that subject is now the story of my life. It is. I'll take it to my grave. The lotus flower. But that's another subject.
I was like, all right, let's go.
So if anyone has any more questions, I'm sure that Dr. McDonald is happy to answer them. But we can wrap up the formal sitting presentation section. Feel free to hang out and mingle, have another drink. Yes.
2 weeks, what is it going to be?
Presentation.